Fun and welcome to this special live interview and Q&A following the premiere of Nova's new documentary, What Are UFOs? In case you haven't seen it already, because maybe you're coming to YouTube later, you can watch this excellent documentary on Nova's YouTube channel or at pbs.org. My name is Matt O'Dowd. I'm an astrophysicist and host of PBS Spacetime, which you should totally go and check out. But today it's my honor and privilege to have with us two of the stars of Nova's premiere, Ryan Graves and Alex Hollings. Ryan and Alex, how are you? Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
I'm great. Yeah, happy to be here.
So I'm gonna give your full bios in just a second, but just for those watching, I just wanted to say if you have questions during this live interview, feel free to type them in, and we'll do our best to get to some of them. But we have a lot to talk about, so no promises. Okay, so our two esteemed guests. We have Ryan Graves. So Ryan is the first active duty pilot to come forward about regular sightings of UAPs, aka UFOs. Ryan's a former lieutenant with the US Navy and an FA-18 pilot who deployed twice in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Inherent Resolve. Ryan was, as I said, the first to come forward, and he's been featured in 60 Minutes, the New York Times, and recently the Joe Rogan Experience. Ryan's the co-founder and executive director of ASA, Americans for Safe Aerospace. ASA is a military pilot-led nonprofit dedicated to aerospace safety and national security with a focus on UAPs. And Ryan volunteers as the first chair of the IAA UAP Integration and Outreach Committee, which serves as a neutral scientific focus group enabling greater aerospace safety. And we have Alex Hollings, pardon me, is editor-in-chief at Sandbox News and a former US Marine, and writes on a range of subjects from defense policy and technology to fitness, all presented through the lens of his experiences as a US Marine, an athlete, and a scholar. Alex is a football and rugby player and a fighter, and has spent the better part of his adult life competing in some of the most physically demanding sports on the planet. Hollings possesses a master's degree in communication from Southern New Hampshire University, as well as a bachelor's degree in corporate organizational communication from Framingham State. Okay, you guys have achieved a lot. So Alex and Ryan, we have quite a bit we can get through today, but I'm going to first of all start by presenting my own position. I am an astrophysicist. I am trained to be skeptical. On PBS Spacetime, we have a bit of a catchphrase, which is that it's never aliens. What I always mutter under my breath after saying that is until it is. But we tend to think that when we want something so much, and believe me, I do want it to be aliens, then I don't trust my own biases. So I'm going to poke you guys a little bit. Your stories are extremely compelling. So I hope you'll forgive my pokes. But the thing that I'm really excited about is that both of you, from my multiple watchings of What Are UFOs, is that I get the impression that you're both quite disinclined to conspiracy and to hype. You're very level-headed, and you're both motivated by some very down-to-earth and very weighty considerations, like safety and security when it comes to understanding what these objects are. And today I want to focus on those things. But first, I want to get your hot take. So there have been some pretty compelling sounding efforts to explain the various observations of these UFOs in terms of instrumental quirks and artifacts, visual illusions like parallax, and we can probe into this in more detail, but I want just quickly, if you had to place a bet, can we possibly explain everything that we've seen as something prosaic, something relatively mundane, under the lens of a visual illusion or artifact? Or are you sure that there are weird vehicles out there? Maybe we start with Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that's a great way that you phrased the question. Because, ultimately, this is a situation where we've come across some data within our lives, whether it was my job as a fighter pilot, whether it was experiences Alex or others have had. Folks have come across very interesting data in their life, and sometimes that has caused them to move on to other things. Sometimes that causes people to further try to investigate and understand what the in some cases, very powerful experiences that they had. And that's a lot of the work I've been doing over the past few years, to be able to gather other experiences from pilots and other professionals to understand just how wide of a scope of this is this problem, both geographically and with the different types of observations that are being seen, and trying to understand, can this all be dismissed, right? And I think in a lot of cases, that would be the best case scenario. If we could dismiss all of these, we could detect, errors in our sensor systems and our operational procedures, and we could make those corrections and be stronger as a country. And we wouldn't have to worry about unidentified objects operating within our airspace that could potentially be adversaries. But unfortunately, I think that the data that's been collected, both from myself as well as the thousands of other people that have reported incidents to me, my confidence level is that 100% that not all of these can be explained. There's just too many interesting performance characteristics with no seeming purpose of intent that has correlations across multiple sightings that spread across years. And for me, I don't think that fits any of the narrow buckets that people have assigned for any of these sightings yet. And of course, that doesn't mean that every sighting that we see is of significance, but I'm very confident that there is something unexplained here, and we need to get to the bottom of it.
All right, I really want to dig into some of the details there, but first I want to get Alex's take. What do you think? Potentially artifacts and illusions, or are we more sure that there is something going on?
I do think that the vast majority of sightings, whether it's civilian and or even military at times, usually are explainable, if not easily explainable nonetheless. I think it's very, very easy to misidentify military aircraft in the sky, especially if you're not trained to identify it or you're not accustomed to seeing things like UH-60 Blackhawks flying at low altitude, in the dark. But the stories, the incidents that really get my attention are the ones, that Ryan speaks about. These ones that are not just the eyewitness accounts of trained observers, of military aviators, but are also these accounts that are backed up with real sensor data that allows us to substantiate what they saw in ways that we can't if I were to just see something outside in my backyard. No matter how anomalous it might have been, I can't recreate that in laboratory settings. I can't make this something that other people can test against. But the data that you can pull from aircraft like Super Hornets that Ryan used to fly substantiates the eyewitness account in a way that is quantifiable. It makes it something that we can test for and test against. And when we have data like that, that substantiates an eyewitness account, I do think that I might have trouble saying 100% anything because of my skepticism and my innate skepticism, but I am very, very confident that there are things that we do not currently have a good explanation for, whether they're technology, whether we're talking about adversary capabilities, or they're natural phenomena or something else. Whatever it is, we don't have a good answer for it, and I am very confident that the list of answers that we could bounce it off of is not complete. So while I am inclined to usually say that's probably not aliens, that's probably flares, or maybe that's a airlift formation of C-17s, 20 miles out, there's definitely something out there that people like Ryan see that we don't have an explanation for, and I can't account for that.
Matt, I would just add real quick. I think we might have jumped a step, right? I think being able to identify an anomaly in the information that we're receiving that seems to be somewhat reputable, at least across time, at least in disparate locations. I think that coming to an acceptance on that fact alone is different than assessing whether there's aliens here, right? I mean, that I don't know how one could conduct or craft a framework that would help us to evaluate an observation in the sky and allow us with a high degree of confidence say that therefore that is an alien from somewhere else, right? So
Yeah, and I
I
think that's
think that's a
a
step too
very good
far.
thing to make explicit right now, is that, the first thing is for us to decide if they are vehicles doing things that we can't explain versus the illusion uh, of those capabilities before we start asking who or what is doing those things. But I think we should dig into those details in a minute. First of all, let's get some stories that weren't in the documentary, because not everything can make it into any one film. Um, and so, Ryan, you were on Joe Rogan last month. Fantastic interview. Congratulations. And I mean, we could pick apart that, what is it, 2.5, 3 hour interview, but there was one particular story that grabbed me, and that's when you talk about how after installing this new radar technology, your crew, your team started to detect these unusual objects. And there's a few things that I really need to ask about, but uh, the when I, my eyes really opened was the story about how there was this first visual sighting from a colleague. Can you tell that again in brief? Give people a picture of what's happening when you switch on the new radar and that visual sighting.
Certainly. So we're operating, this is 2013, we're operating in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And when we go fly, we're operating in a very large cube that's off the coast of Virginia to the east, all over water, starting about 10 miles out. And we upgraded our older APG 73 to the APG 79. A few numbers away, sure, but a very monumental leap in technology to a whole new paradigm of radar technology. So we had high hopes for the detection ranges and the size of objects and the capability it would bring to bear. And it took about 8 months for that upgrade to happen. But as soon as we were flying in one of the jets with the upgraded radar, we were immediately seeing a number of objects within our working areas, specifically within our working areas, that we weren't seeing with the older radar systems. And these objects had peculiar flight characteristics. They would be anywhere from stationary to supersonic, and flying different types of flight patterns as well. Completely stationary, holding patterns, meandering patterns, sometimes just bombing out east at very, very high speeds. And we initially assumed it was a radar error, even though our radar provides a confidence level of the tracks we're seeing, the objects out there. And these were all very what we call stable track files. There really was no other information that we could use to make any other assessment other than these were probably just not real objects. However, we started to correlate what we were seeing out there with other sensors on our aircraft from our AT FLIR system and infrared and electro-optical sensor and targeting pod, our air-to-air missiles, the AIM-9X, would lock onto these objects, and our other electronic warfare and RF capabilities would also be identifying these objects as well. And that was when we really triggered that, hey, these are physical objects. We have multiple sensors across various bands of the spectrum that are very clearly showing if something is here, we need to start respecting these as potentially real objects. And that kind of came to a head about a month later when two fighters from my squadron were flying out in close formation about 150 feet apart. And as soon as they crossed the threshold into the working area, one of these objects went about 50 feet down the right side of the lead aircraft and split the two aircraft. The pilot canceled the flight after that, circled back, and I met him on deck in the ready room, and he just said, I almost hit one of those darn things. And we all knew what he was talking about. We didn't have a name for them yet. And our first question was, what did they look like? Because we've been trying to visually gain an ID, but failing to do so. So this was our first opportunity. And he just described it as a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. And it was very likely the object was relatively stationary at the entry point, and the aircraft were providing the relative motion for the object. But still a pretty harrowing incident, and it required us to then file a hazard report with the Navy due to the proximity. And once we, the safety officer recognized as an issue, we kind of did a survey of the squadron. As it turned out, there were 4 other near mid-airs that went unreported on these same objects over the past month.
If you don't
Okay.
mind, I'd love to add to
Yeah,
that.
please.
So something that Ryan spoke to there was that they first detected this on radar with that AN/APG 79, which is an active electronically scanned array radar. These systems have an incredible degree of fidelity and detection range. But then they also detected it with that forward-looking infrared, and then also with the infrared sensor on the Sidewinder missile, which is a heat-seeking missile. It's a short-range air-to-air weapon. So the radar is broadcasting electromagnetic energy out in front of the aircraft on the X-band and then reading the energy that's reflected back to it. So the radar works literally by sending out energy, and then if when that energy hits something, it reflects back to the aircraft, and the aircraft is able to detect and track that object. But the forward-looking infrared and the Sidewinder are passive sensors. These things detect a difference in heat versus background radiation, right? So you're not only seeing this thing with your eyes in some cases, it's reflecting electromagnetic energy broadcast by the radar, and it's also emanating energy that's being detected by the forward-looking infrared, and then also the Sidewinder missile. These all work in different spectrums. They're all very different sensors meant to do different things. So it's really, really unlikely that you would get, you know, when I say a phantom, I don't necessarily mean a phantom. These radar arrays are so powerful, they can detect things that may not physically be there. Shifts in barometric pressure, crazy stuff. That's why it's good to check the FLIR as well. We saw it in the engagement between Iran and Israel earlier this year, this past April, where U.S. Air Force Strike Eagles were detecting drones on their radar, but they couldn't see them. So they had to turn to their forward-looking infrared to make sure what they were looking at were real targets. You use multiple sensors to make sure that what you see is really there and it's what you think it is. And if all 3 of these sensors are seeing something there, and I've read some accounts, I think they were actually yours, Ryan, where you couldn't even always visually see the object, but you would get reads from all 3 of these disparate sensors. That's really wild stuff. And I think, for a fighter pilot like Ryan, who like lives in this tech, it just seems like second nature. But to those of us out here who think a PlayStation 5 is pretty advanced and capable, it really says something when the fighter pilot sees something with his eyes, but also these very different and very advanced and capable sensors are also kind of confirming what the pilot sees is really something.
Yeah, and this is science, right? This is making independent measurements, and it's the same team, but they're independent. In astronomy, we get we spot things on the sky, with one instrument all the time that turns out just to be noise or an artifact. But if you see it in multiple different wave bands or at different times, then credence grows quickly. Um, so, I mean, in this case, it sounds more than a safety issue, Ryan. It sounds like, this should have gone pretty high up. You have these, well, sound like multiple, perhaps you can talk about how many vehicles or objects in an area where the US Navy is actively operating. I mean, this sounds like it's an immediate national security issue. Um, would that be the case? I mean, is that what happened?
So at the time, not necessarily. I think we were just looking for the easiest rational explanation to be able to put a box around what we were seeing and go back and do our mission, right? Because it's not our job flying these aircraft that cost about $30,000 per hour to fly, to go off and take on tasks that are outside the scope of what we're training to do. So by filing that safety report and then by having the conversation with our commanding officer, who's presumably running that up the chain of command, I think we all had an expectation that it would get resolved through some mechanism within the Pentagon or elsewhere at some time in the near future. But that ultimately wasn't the case. We continued to see these objects, and again, it was about 3 to 4 to 7 or 8 objects that were operating within our working space, not respecting the internal boundaries, and even often spilling out of the exterior boundaries of this working area as well, where there's international flight lanes to the north and other flight lanes to the south. So, I mean, in direct conflict with commercial traffic, and we're seeing these spill over those borders.
And this is localized, right? So the new radar technology is in operation in this zone, and these things are detected as soon as the technology comes online in those zones. I assume these radars are used elsewhere now. Have similar things been seen where these radars are used?
Yeah, so the radar systems initially were a larger capability that was fielded on ground stations and then ships. And then eventually, as the swap constraints were optimized, we were able to fit the same technology essentially onto a fighter aircraft. I don't have access to the data sets, and it's hard to really hear too much information about what these larger systems may have been detecting, but some of those are on the East Coast today and have not had much luck detecting some of these objects that have been operating in the vicinity of New Jersey. But yes, we did upgrade, continue to upgrade our jets. Other squadrons within the East Coast area upgraded their radars, and those upgrades have promulgated to the West Coast and elsewhere. And this was a learning process for us as well, because I wasn't actively investigating these during this time. It was just something we were mitigating while we were, doing our jobs. But as I learned and started to speak with other guys from different areas, I learned that, yeah, guys, we're seeing this in other parts of the country when they upgraded the radar systems. It wasn't just restricted to the East Coast working areas. Pilots were seeing them on the West Coast. They were seeing them in the Nevada training ranges. They were seeing them in the Gulf of Mexico or America. I'm not sure what we're calling it now. But yeah, so absolutely, there have been, an increased reports due to these radar technologies. And, even after we had the incidents in Virginia Beach, we went on a detachment aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. And when we got down there, the objects were either already there or they followed us down, because we had over a dozen incidents with these objects while we were executing this very large training mission to qualify us to actually go on deployment. So a very significant multi-ship, all-airwing event. And that's where we record the famous gimbal video, the Go Fast video. And it reached such a crescendo that the admiral in charge of the entire carrier strike group was threatening to cancel the entire training evolution because we were having too many mid-airs with what he was presuming were some type of classified technology. And he was emailing basically all the major commands on the East Coast saying, please stop. Like, we're going to have to cancel things here. Who owns this technology?
Right. I mean, wild technology, if it's a sphere inside a cube, or was it the other way around? I mean, it doesn't sound vehicle-like. The description that your colleague gave after that encounter, which would, I mean, how close was their visual? Was it, clear as day?
Yeah, 50 feet right down the cockpit. Yep.
And have there been others that close?
Yeah, there was. So we define a near midair as any unintentional penetration of a 500-foot bubble around your aircraft, which is quite close when you're flying next to an F-18. 500 feet, 50 feet is, you think you're going to be hit. You can't really tell there's not enough angular distance with the relative motion to make a determination of even going to hit you. So, I mean, that was a freeze frame for him, right? Am I about to get hit? Went down my wing.
And I guess there's no dash cam on these. I mean, nor can they carry their iPhones to take pics. But it seems like,
guys do carry the cameras. They do carry the cameras. It's theoretically not allowed, but it's commonly done for kind of safety reasons if you're on the road and you break down or if you ejected. But in an instance like that, it's just too fast for you to even think about pulling. It's tucked away and turned off. And there is a camera on the front that records the HUD, and it's an actual camera that records the HUD, but that has to be specifically turned on and in the right recording mode, kind of left record, right record. And that's typically something we do when we do what we call our fence-in checks when we're about to go into our tactical administration and get ready for our fight. So those cameras wouldn't have been on yet.
All right. Well, all right. So that's the broader context of we don't get all of that in the Nova documentary, but you can go to Joe Rogan and get the works. Now, Alex, you have your own encounter, I believe. Would you care to tell us a little bit about your own experience?
Sure, it is nowhere near as interesting or cool. But I was maybe 10 years old or so. I want to say it was 1994 or 95. And at the time, I was living in Torrington, Connecticut, which is sort of the northwest corner of the state. And I was staying up late with my older brother and his friend, and they asked me to run out to my dad's car to get a deck of cards out of the glove box that we kept there for road trips. And I went running out there, not really thinking about how late at night it was. And as I opened the passenger side door to my dad's car, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like there was somebody standing right behind me. So I span around, sort of expecting it to be my brother or his friend, just sort of picking on me, and there was nobody there. But just then, a really, really I don't think I can overstate how big it seemed. Black triangular aircraft crested the trees behind the house across the street from me. Not as though it was hovering up, but as though it had been flying toward me at low enough altitude that I couldn't see it behind the tree line until then. And it sort of just passed over me, moving fairly slowly at really low altitude and with very little noise. And it unnerved me so much that I dropped the cards, left the door open, and just ran up the stairs calling for my brother and my parents. By the time they got out there was nothing there to see. The triangle had already sort of crested the tree line on the other side of my yard. And, my parents were really nice about it. They were like, I'm sure what you saw was an airplane. This was before the B-2 Spirit had entered operational service, but the whole world knew that there were stealth aircraft and triangular aircraft and stuff in the works. We had seen pictures of the F-117 by then and things. And my parents were like, it was probably just an Air Force bomber or something. But I really didn't feel as though it was. And so the next year, when I got selected for independent study in my junior high, I decided to investigate UFOs to try to figure out what it was that I saw. Uh, and I didn't make it very far, but I did manage to get a hold of a man named Stanton Friedman, who was a former nuclear physicist who had become a UFO researcher and was pretty prominent in the field at the time. And he sent me a whole packet full of declassified reports from Project Blue Book and things like that, some reports he had written himself, some eyewitness accounts. And, for a 10-year-old, for an 11-year-old who was just starting my research journey, it was a treasure trove. And over the years since, I have, my career as a defense journalist with a focus on military and aerospace technologies. That's always been sort of in the back of my mind, going, what did I see? I've looked into reports of the TR-3B, and I found them to be not particularly credible. However, there are certainly lots of classified aircraft, some of which we still don't know about necessarily, that have been tested and flown over the years. Why you might fly one over Torrington, Connecticut in the middle of the night in the mid-90s, I couldn't say. But it definitely informed the trajectory of my life. And when I got out of the Marine Corps and I started working for defense contractors in the aerospace field, that was still there. And when I decided to pursue journalism and sort of walk away from the defense contractor world, I do think that it informed my interest in aerospace technology, and in a lot of ways is the reason why I'm a journalist today. So I have no idea what the heck I saw, now 30 years ago or so. But I do know that whatever it was unusual enough to really have a lasting impact on me. And I think it's easier to be dismissive of a 10-year-old who saw a triangle in the sky than a Super Hornet pilot who saw it on his radar and with his eyes. But in all the years since, I haven't come across something that convinced me that what I saw was something easily explainable. I am not sure what I believe it was, but I do know that it sort of pointed me in this direction, and at least for that, I'm grateful.
Well, for anyone who doesn't know, Alex has an incredible YouTube channel, Sandbox XX, which goes into an incredible amount of detail about latest military technology, a lot of new fighter technology. And so maybe that 10-year-old didn't have the ability to know what a black triangle in the sky is, but I feel like the Alex Hollings sitting here right now does.
That means a lot.
He needs to trust his 10-year-old memory, but I feel like
Yeah.
he's been thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah, it was, I suppose, I think it is worth noting that the types of unusual things people have seen in the sky have changed over the years, sort of alongside pop culture to some extent. And my own sighting included. By the mid 90s, triangular aircraft, triangular spacecraft were sort of the flavor of the day. And I think that does run parallel to the technologies that we also knew were emerging at the time that informed pop culture. And then that again kind of brings us back to, military witnesses like Ryan, who their sightings don't sort of adhere to those pop culture informed expectations. And that's another thing about them that I find so interesting. So again, while I do tend to approach the topic with skepticism, I don't know. I love the mystery of it. There's definitely something interesting going on. And when I can't come up with an answer readily, because as you said, I spend a lot of time researching this, that's when I really start to salivate. And that is why this is such a cool topic, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's so interesting to me that the image of the UFO and even the existence of the UFO has evolved with, whatever the current zeitgeist was. There weren't reports before we started realizing that we could travel to the stars. Then we imagined they might be here, and then we started seeing them. So I agree that it's a very different question whether highly trained fighter pilots have seen a thing versus whether the UFO phenomenon more broadly is maybe mass hysteria is too strong, but certainly informed. I think Alex, you say in the film that well, you implied that we see what we expect to see in a sense. Do you think that this might be an explanation for the broader UFO phenomenon?
I think it certainly is for a fair portion, for a large portion. I would even argue the majority of sightings, especially those that come from the civilian world, and well, I think we saw this in real time recently with the drones over New Jersey, where there certainly were some large and fairly exotic looking drones that people spotted. But before long, it just sort of became any drone. And after that, it became any light. And before long, you sort of have a glut of reports where, yeah, maybe 99% of those aren't really something of particular interest. That 1% gets really difficult to sort of sift out once kind of the zeitgeist takes over, I guess. And that's why I do think data collection, data acquisition needs to be the focus for UAP studies. I mean, it already is for serious UFO UAP researchers. It needs to be in the future as we move forward, and we need to allocate more resources to it. Because as we talk about, again, being able to get quantifiable and repeatable data, that's not just about being able to substantiate the claims of eyewitnesses. It's also about identifying trends in the data over time. Because if you can establish a number of things, on an X-band radar, you might see this. On an infrared search and track targeting system, you might see this. With certain types of infrared detection systems, you might see this. On the electromagnetic spectrum, you might see this frequency to this frequency. If we can narrow the data points down and things like what Ryan saw and what his colleagues saw, and find a pattern, find the commonality between these sightings, it gives us something to start looking for, as opposed to just being something we use to explain as we look back.
Well, and also to assess these claims. For example, if you turn on a new radar system and you start seeing things immediately, then they were surely there before you turned on the system. If you see them in multiple places, then you can start to wonder how widespread these are, and you immediately, in fact, you could calculate Is much of the ocean covered with these strange devices, or are they correlated with where the military presence is? All sorts of questions like that you should be able to start to answer. And, it gives me shivers immediately to think about the abundance of these things, if that's right. Ryan, is that a fair assessment that these things could
Yeah,
be?
we've talked about how we've seen these up and down the East Coast, the West Coast, in other areas of the United States, but these are very often spotted elsewhere across the world as well, from Europe and especially Eastern Asia as well. Significant sightings over the Pacific uh, and closer to mainland China as well. So that was one of the things that I learned when I further started to investigate and receive reports from other pilots, and not just pilots, but system operators, weapon operators, radar operators that have left the service and want to share, nothing classified, of course, but at least the anecdotal data that's be like, yep, we are seeing them in these spots. We are checking using strategic assets in the areas that you claim to see them, and yes, we were seeing them there. So, absolutely, by being able to gather this data, it allows us to better understand the scope of the problem and how we need to address it.
Does it feel strange to you at all that if these things really are so common, that a clear, visual photograph hasn't appeared yet, or is the ocean too large or something like that?
That doesn't really bother me as a major flaw in the logic here. The average camera phone is not necessarily designed to take a high contrast photo of a singular light or a distant object at night. And they apply all sorts of algorithms on top of the sensor data itself to be able to create, even skin tones and to clear out shadows and things of that nature. So our system, it's like anything else, any other sensor we build sensors for specific purposes because we can optimize it and ensure that we're receiving the proper data. So just because we have a sensor on us and it's not gathering information, I don't think we should use that as logic to discount the entire conversation.
Yeah, I suppose, and to that point, if you were trusting a radar track only, the F-117 wouldn't appear on it, right? So if you don't have the right tools, you won't be able to detect what you're looking for, depending on if it's actively trying to hide from you or if it's just something that's difficult to detect. You need to have the right tools. So, visual light for us is very generic. We expect things to appear in visual light. But, you as an astrophysicist know far better than I do that there's a plethora of things we can see outside the spectrum of our own visual light. And we use sensors to be able to appreciate those things. And I think it stands to reason that whatever these things are, and I think that the answer is likely multiple things. When it comes to these truly anomalous objects, there may be some of one thing and some of another. They may not all be the same explanation, but the one thing they have in common is that they defy easy classification and easy identification using the common tools we have available, photographs and our naked eye. But it does seem as though as more advanced sensors come online, it's important to note something Ryan just touched on, these systems weren't designed to detect UAP. They weren't designed to go find anomalous phenomena. They were designed to identify and target adversary aircraft and things of that nature. So they're still not necessarily tuned really to the job. But as these better and better fidelity sensors come online, we're gathering more and more data. And, when you look back to the 2004 Nimitz incident, those aircraft did not have active electronically scanned array radar. However, that was the first deployment where these aircraft were fusing target data with the Aegis combat system on the destroyers and cruisers that they were flying around, creating sort of a fused battle space image with incredibly powerful radar arrays that are ship-based. So again, really powerful sensors that are capable of gathering data that we can't necessarily pick up with the naked eye and may not necessarily be able to see with a camera because of the distance or because of light, things like that. So I think it is important that we recognize that even though we expect everything to, show up in the picture we take with our iPhone, we expect to be able to see things very easily. We are well aware scientifically that there are things we can't see easily with some common tools that we use, and certainly not with the naked eye at great distances, right? I mean, I'm blind in my left eye anyway, so if I see something weird in the sky, I usually assume it's an airplane until I ask my wife what it is, because it's just a speck to me. Uh, we
So, Ryan, I want to ask a question from our viewers while we're still close to the topic. And you've talked about this. Planetasia asks, a lot of the scientific community looks for data on, well, in general, but certainly on UAPs, UFOs. So what can we do to get data to the scientists, whether it's from pilots or the military, and which scientists does that data need to get to in your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in my mind, there's two types of data sets that I've been engaged in efforts to try to pursue. And the first of those are observational data from individuals and humans, the human sensor. And we receive reports through Americans for Safe Aerospace. You can go to safeaerospace.com and you can submit a report right there. It's confidential. Most, if not almost all, of the pilots we speak with are concerned for their professional reputation and their career by reporting these instances. So we treat that information very carefully. But we do collaborate with some scientific groups to evaluate that information, that data that we receive, both from a perspective on what was observed, as well as from the perspective of how did the pilots react to what they saw, so that we can then inform through, a chain of custody of research and papers to say, here's, how we can improve the situation for pilots, and here's, the thinking and logic that went behind it. On the sensor side, I think there's a number of things that can be done. The traditional conversation is around how government sensors have access to this information, and everyone else has access to their iPhone or whatever camera system they want to purchase. And I think 10, 15, 20 years ago, that conversation was heavily weighed on the military side, where you simply could not purchase or acquire the same type of sensor capabilities that the military was using. On the civilian side, both cost and technology prohibited. But with, I think, the proliferation of very capable digital systems today, there's a number of options for gaining additional information from these objects. There's a lot of great work being done in passive radar technologies on the civilian side that you can operate without a license to be able to identify objects using source signals. There's very capable AI augmented camera systems that can be utilized to fuse into a larger data set of a single object. And so a civilian researcher, theoretically, with unlimited funds, could build an RF tracking system, a passive radar system, electro-optical IR, and optical system that would be sufficient, I think, to build a significant data set on this. And there's some groups that are working on that. So I think we're uniquely situated, especially right now with the proliferation of commercial space technology as well. Being able to integrate over the shelf and startup based technology into space in a much more economical manner is going to open up a wide range of capabilities for sensing that we haven't had before. So I think we're really on a cusp of being able to generate that data en masse, as long as there are people willing to invest their time and resources into doing so.
I assume there's a hurdle in getting data taken from a military facility to a civilian researcher, and is that a major impediment?
That's part of the challenge, is that there is no unified reporting procedure. The Navy made big steps toward doing that early on, and the Air Force, I would argue, is still dragging its feet on it. I speak to fighter pilots in the Air Force, and they're very dismissive of the UAP topic culturally. There needs to be a standard procedure, not just for these reports to sort of go up to, not just go up the chain of command, but to go to a centralized office that will investigate them. But the procedure also needs to include data collection and storage. Data doesn't necessarily occupy physical space, but it does to some extent on a ship, on a carrier strike group. You can only save so much data. You need to transmit this someplace else for further analysis, after action reports, things of that nature. That data needs to not go away when a pilot sees something really unusual. It needs to be collected, and it needs to be it needs to be carried alongside that pilot account to someone who can investigate it. And we need to standardize that process so that you are getting comparable data in that centralized location rather than disparate data from disparate sensors as we have for the past decades.
Yeah, there hasn't been a place that collates and organizes that information in a way that would lead to the outcomes that you're suggesting, Matt, where a private organization or a research team could put a proposal into an office to study the information, the data that they have brought together. Now there is the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and that is part of their congressional mandate to do that. At least parts of what I said. So, that's part of the kind of fight that has been going on, be able to legitimize the topic to ensure that we're not just ignoring these systems because of this inherent stigma around the conversation and treating it as if is a real object, because we do exist in the real world. We do have adversaries, and we do have some that are proceeding in very aggressive ways to develop new capabilities that may have bypassed some of the capabilities we've built. And we have to be very cognizant. We're not used to technological surprise in the United States, but warfare is drastically changing with autonomy, with small form factor drones and other assets, and they can be very lethal. And if we're not prepared to be able to deal with that issue from a defense standpoint, we're going to be in real trouble.
Do you think this stigma is because of the implication that a UAP is, it sounds like you said you saw a UFO or a flying saucer. Is that where it comes from originally?
I think so. I think deep down there's a real fear of the uncertainty. If think of the average person that's operating, a multi-billion-dollar radar system. It's just, an average person that has their life experiences. They're thrust into a position to be able to operate something that has exquisite capabilities and engineering behind it, and to have something unexplainable that they're afraid that they might lose their ability to do their job because people might no longer trust their assessment of the information. That's a real risk, and for a pilot, that's critical to your career.
Yeah, that doesn't sound great.
It's all risk, no reward, ultimately.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you testified in front of Congress. How did that come about? Was this sort of a campaign of you were partly instrumental in? I know you were the first to come forward with these reports. Was that sort of a culmination of your efforts, and has the response been as you hoped?
There was no lobbying or for myself. It came as a surprise when I received the phone call and the invitation. So, I think I was selected to speak because not only could I speak to the experiences that I had and folks within my squadron, but at that time we had already been collecting reports from hundreds of pilots, and I could speak to the broader issues at play. As far as outcomes I hoped that would come from that, and did we achieve them? Frankly, it's a good question. And, my only goal going into there was to raise the level of awareness on the national security and aviation safety implications of what we had seen. And when I say we, I mean, include David Fravor in that, but that's also a different conversation than the conversation that David Grush had. His was, of a different experience that wasn't the aviator's experience in the conversation. So I'll only speak to, I think, the messaging that I tried to put across, and I know David Fravor tried to put across, and I think we were successful in raising the urgency of what pilots have been seeing. And I think that recent events both in Ukraine, with the uncertainty in New Jersey, and other base incursions that have happened over the past several years, that I think slowly it is having uptake, although perhaps not the speed I would have liked.
So let's get to some nitty gritty. So in the documentary, there's some, to me as a skeptical, astronomer, seemed like some pretty compelling alternative explanations of some of these, particularly these infrared videos from Nick West, Sean Kirkpatrick, and others. So, for example, the case of the gimbal object, um, Mick West gives what feels like a very plausible explanation of it being uh, a glare in the lens of the camera itself, and so the for those who haven't watched, you have this object that's moving fairly smoothly, and then it rotates in a way that, certainly I've never seen an aircraft rotate before. And Mick West points out that the camera itself rotates, and as it does so, so would any glare. And so he claims that it's probably the glare from a much more distant, probably airplane, rather than a physical object of the shape of that, that sort of ovaloid. So, Ryan, what do you think about that? Does that sound, plausible, or
Well, I think,
is it a bit simple?
yeah, I mean, I understand the analysis that's occurring. They're taking one slice of the information that's available in this conversation, and they're using that to pick it apart in order to make a rational, not rational is not the right word, but starting from the point of what's the most likely prosaic explanation for what this camera system is seeing during this 6 or 7 seconds. But ultimately, that analysis doesn't really doesn't incorporate the operational elements and the other sensor systems that we utilize that discount that analysis. For example, the FLIR doesn't just stare off into space in front of the jet and act as a camera that happens to catch things. Everything is tied to our radar systems. And in this jet, flying an APG-79 radar and having just finished a very complex and large air-to-air training mission with a perfectly functioning radar, the crew then turned back to the ship and detected multiple other objects that were not supposed to be within our airspace that were operating near the aircraft carrier. They then traversed over 50 miles utilizing their radar to locate these objects and to try to understand what they were. And as they finally got close enough, the other sensors were then able to correlate these objects, both the FLIR system, which is what captured the gimbal video that was released, as well as our air-to-air missiles that are now locking up onto these objects as well. And when we receive information in the jet, it's not just there or not there, black and white. We are given a confidence level of what we call it a track file quality, right? It's because we have to launch weapons with these systems. We need to know that there's not jamming that's coming down range. We need to know that these are not decoys that are out there. These are all things we deal with every day. So we're very in tune to using multiple sensors to correlate and understand whether this is something we should waste a missile on or not. And during this entire process, the air crew had extremely high confidence of where this object was. They flew over to it. The FLIR picked it up on the expected range as they closed in based off of the information their radar was giving us. And they flew within 4 to 6 miles of this object when they captured that video. So any analysis that only looks at that video and makes assumptions about what it must be because of certain things within the video, and I'm not as smart on the exact analysis to label or list them all right now, it doesn't take into account all these other systems that were providing much more accurate information and guiding the crew to exactly where it was. So to have all these sensors failing in a coordinated fashion to misrepresent where a target track is just not how our systems work, and it would require, a pretty large leap of faith for me to assume that's what happened.
Okay, so to make sure I'm clear, there are multiple independent measures of the location. So you know that it's within whatever 4 or so kilometers versus a more distant aircraft at 30 kilometers.
Correct.
But otherwise, is the explanation of the rotation of the flare as coming from the rotating gimbal plausible?
I don't know enough about the internal engineering of the system to say whether it's possible or not. I'll just say in the hundreds of hours that myself and my crewmates have looked through the FLIR system, we've never seen anything like that.
Got it. Alex, what's your take on some of these efforts to debunk some of the video?
Well, I think the efforts are vital because as we said before, a great percentage, a vast majority of sightings do tend to turn out to be everyday objects that are just difficult to identify. So the debunking efforts are really important, and we should keep doing them in a respectful and skeptical way. But we also shouldn't lean into them in the same way we might lean into our beliefs about what these are. If you're prone to believing that there are alien spacecraft, your cognitive bias might make you tend to believe that they're alien spacecraft. If you're prone to believe that they're not, we have to be aware of those cognitive biases as well. So I do think that the demonstration that Mick West gave was viable. And just as I said in the documentary, I think it's plausible, but I don't think that it explains away the footage. And the reason is for, exactly what Ryan laid out. The same way, if you were to walk outside right now and see something unusual in the sky behind your house, and you were to pull out your phone and record a short video of it, and then show that video to other people, they can see what was captured on that camera, but they can't feel what you could feel at the time. They can't hear exactly what you could hear at the time. And those aren't sensor systems you have available to you. That's just you physically being present in the moment. And fighter pilots have the same thing. You're looking at this footage through the FLIR camera, but not only is that pilot assessing sensor data from multiple different sensors, they're also pulling from a great deal of experience that I think it's important that we not discount. When we're talking about combat aviators, one of the things that's really important to do as a pilot is be able to identify aircraft at great distance and come up with a sense of what aircraft it may be and how and where it's traveling. Is it coming toward me? Is it moving away? Is it moving in a perpendicular way? And then as you look at it like that, you need to make predictions about what you think that aircraft is going to do. If it's going to engage you, if this is an adversary aircraft, the way it's moving can give you a tip as to where it's going to move with the conservation of energy. Physics sort of dictate some degree of maneuverability, aerobatic maneuverability. So when you're a pilot and you're looking at these objects with your eyes and with multiple different sensors, you are privy to more data in the moment than we are after the fact, looking at the unclassified footage that's been released. So I think it's super important, and I encourage people to debunk, because we do need to sort of sift the everyday occurrences away from the truly anomalous to be able to find those data points that we're looking for. But simultaneously, I would say it's important that we, look at our own biases in the face. And if we are innately skeptical, as I tend to be, I try my best to acknowledge that and go, I'm prone to think that this is probably an everyday object, but I can't actually justify that line of thought completely with the evidence available. So I need to accept the fact that maybe it's something that I can't explain away. And I think that this is a good example of that, where I think Mick West is operating from a position of trying to explain it away, which is very important work. And ultimately, we need to take that and decide whether or not the box that he built uh, could fit this object that we're looking at, or if the object that we're looking at exists outside that box, which is just as important a conclusion to draw. So I'm inclined to believe the aviator in instances like this, whereas often I would be more dismissive of eyewitness accounts, because aviators are trained specifically, military aviators are trained specifically to fight in the sky. And in order to do that, you have to be able to trust your sensors and your senses. And that's there's much more to that than just the footage, I suppose.
Certainly a good case for getting more data to people. I mean, I feel like Mick West's explanation fits the IR data very nicely, if I'm honest. But I imagine that Mick did not have access to, and maybe didn't know about all of these other data, which reduced the goodness of his fit.
Well, the information, the data exists. I mean, the radar data was recorded in these instances. It was attached to the same file as the gimbal video was before it was stripped out. And I watched it be debriefed in the intelligence spaces after the flight. So this is part of the problem, and I think why it's important to bring attention and energy to this, because I think there are answers that can be brought forward with additional release of information from the government. We have these incredibly capable sensor systems. They have recorded these instances. They do correlate, or they do align with the pilot reports. And I think, we're never really going to get an answer having just this tiny sliver of information that's debatable out there, when we have very solid information that's hidden behind lock and key.
Yeah, the oversimplification of this topic is a real challenge, because there is data, as Ryan points out, there is data that could be poured over. And to be honest, I'm not even entirely sure that all that data is available to people like Sean Kirkpatrick. And to some extent, there's good reason for that. When you're talking about a system like the APG-79, this radar array and the Super Hornet, if you reveal its ability to detect this object at this distance, at this speed, and it's this size, you are to some extent revealing some information about the capability set of that radar array. And that information could be valuable to adversary powers who are trying to develop their own stealth aircraft that may ultimately one day be in a fight against these Super Hornets. I understand the reason behind the classification, but I think that I think that the government errs on the side of overclassification, particularly when it comes to these things, in part because they don't know what they are. And because they don't know what they are, they could be adversary systems. They could be systems that we're developing in SAP programs and special access programs. Because they don't know what they are, they think they could be a secret. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, is that the best data we have to analyze this topic is often under lock and key.
Got it. All right, so we're gonna wrap soon, but let's just get wildly speculative for a minute, just for fun. Let's assume that these objects, are vehicles of some sort. They're not illusions. They're not instrumental artifacts. Based on some of the performance characteristics of these objects, the accelerations, the rotations, the thing that went below the water and up again. Both of you have the creds to answer this, I think. Is there any plausible near medium future secret technology that is likely to be able to explain this? Could these be clandestine programs by the US government, by another government? I'd love to get both of your takes on that.
Ryan, you've been in more cool rooms with more secrets than I have.
Working off the assumptions that you listed, I think it's hard. And of course I can't speak about the whole topic broadly, right? But in my head, I have, a list of interesting cases that have certain performance characteristics, and I'll work off of that broadly. But you gave me a little bit of room, so I'll wiggle a bit. But at least for the short term, and for the medium term, which maybe I'll define as 10 years, I don't think that we're observing technology that is within a 10-year window, frankly. And just to get, well, you weren't looking for an answer, you're looking for speculation. So what could those technologies be? Is there some type of electromagnetic propulsion system, a plasma-based propulsion system, or at least plasma as a byproduct propulsion system? A lot of these objects seem to be emitting a very even energy from it, whether it's IR or wherever it's coming in the spectrum. And, just to your point, Matt, the gimbal video looks that way, not necessarily because that's the physical shape of the object, but because that's the IR energy that's being received. And that could be created through a propulsion system or otherwise not represent the physical structure of the craft itself. I'm not aware of any type of propulsion system that utilizes those technologies. I think, there was some interesting work on how was it?
like the e-drive type thing?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. I'm forgetting the exact name at the moment, but yeah, essentially being able to change the airflow around an aircraft using electromagnetic fields. You have to ionize the field in front of it, which would likely result in a plasma around the object itself. I think that's one of the short-term technologies that might be feasible to emulate some of these capabilities, but the power requirements for a system like that are beyond the energy storage or generation capabilities that I'm aware of.
Okay, so medium to far future, which is fascinating.
I'm
Alex,
not
did
going
you
to
have
get
anything?
into the whole space-time warping, Matt, because I know you're gonna frown heavily at me, and I'll be speaking out of my area of expertise. But of course, I would carry all the interesting math, at least that's been done on the manipulation of space-time geometry in order to be able to maneuver an aircraft using the differential in space-time. Again, not my area of expertise, but
You just need a mass equivalence of the planet Jupiter, and it's relatively straightforward. Uh,
exactly. So there's some difficulties there
and
too.
and negative mass. I'm not a. I think along with Miguel Alcubierre, I not a believer that this is an extant technology. Certainly now, and I'm also a fan of this guy Einstein, so I suspect not ever. But the first thing you said, that sounds very plausible.
You asked me to speculate.
I appreciate it. Alex, any hot speculations before we wrap up?
Well, I think the problem I guess I run into is that I'm familiar with several technologies that could easily explain one aspect of a lot of these anomalous sightings, but not others, And then there are technologies that are right on the cusp, emerging technologies like laser-induced plasma filament holograms, which the Navy's experimented with using as infrared missile countermeasures. Effectively, you use a laser to ionize the air to produce a 2D or three-dimensional plasma plume in midair to confuse an inbound infrared guided or heat-seeking missile. And that certainly could produce, something that you would see on a forward-looking infrared camera. It could certainly move in ways that a physical object couldn't, because effectively it's a laser. You can move a laser really quickly. Anybody with a cat and a laser pointer has experimented with that. However, that wouldn't produce a radar return, for instance. And in cases like the Nimitz incident with Commander Fravor, that wouldn't produce a physical object that you could really look at and see with the naked eye and see as a physical object. Conversely, there are, scramjet propulsion systems that have been in development for systems like the high-speed attack cruise missile or the hypersonic attack cruise missile. These are air-breathing jet engines that can fly at speeds well in excess of Mach 5, but usually not for very long. And the systems we've had in testing thus far are one-offs. They can't slow down again to come in for a landing, so they're in a single-use technology demonstrator or now in missile applications. There are technologies that can, to some extent, match the speed that we've seen, but not the inertia beating changes of direction. There are technologies that could give you that inertia beating change of direction, like these plasma hologram filaments, but they wouldn't produce a radar return because they're not a physical body in space. So I guess that's the problem that I run into, is that I say, well, I can explain 80% of that. It's that last 10% that leaves me befuddled. And to be honest, with these truly anomalous sightings, the sort of the gems in the rough, I I would argue that we do not have technology. And if the United States doesn't have this technology in the military industrial complex, that's not to say that China can't. However, the United States invests more, especially into air power, into aviation technology than any other nation on the planet. And while engineering brilliance is not limited by geography, resources tend to be. And there are no stakeholders with more vested interest in owning the sky than the United States military. So I am inclined to believe that if this is technology or capabilities that the US And I don't just mean can't bring to bear, but I mean hasn't even experimented with. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to see that technology out of Iran or North Korea or even China, though they do have a vast, hypersonic academic infrastructure and things like that. Uh, I think that the United States military tends to be at the forefront of these emerging technologies. And if it's so far outside of that that it doesn't really seem like anything that Uncle Sam has even tucked away in a hangar at Groom Lake, it's pretty unlikely that it's an adversary power. But that's certainly something that I could be wrong about, and history has shown that significant technological advances can come from where you least expect it. So it's certainly possible, but I would argue that there is no 100% solution for a lot of these sightings.
Yeah, and it's also possible that any given clearance level may not know what even the US
And
has up its sleeve.
and by design, if you're not a part of the program, you won't be read into it regardless of clearance level, right?
Well, I'm going to be looking up a lot more. I already look up a little bit, but now uh, this has been fascinating, and we managed to get to a lot more compelling details than there was time for in the documentary. So I hope our listeners have enjoyed that deep dive. Um, any parting words, guys? Ryan?
No, I'd echo your sentiment. Just look up. This does seem to be more common than people realize, and I think it's worth having a conversation with your friends whether they've ever seen one, because I think you might be surprised.
Alex, how you want to
Well,
sign out?
I self-serving plug. We have multiple deep dives into the UAP topic on Sandbox News, and we have several videos about it on our YouTube channel. I'd highly recommend that you go check it out. We don't draw any conclusions, but we do work really hard to try to equip you to draw your own.
Well, this has been really, really interesting. Thanks everyone for staying up if you're on the East Coast. Uh, and
Nope, I might have lost you, Matt.
Oh, I'm back now.
Nope, I think you're back, Matt.